An elderly maid, who was forbidden to play the piano, sat down at the grand piano and amazed the entire audience. Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and watch other stories. The morning light crept slowly through the thin curtains of Clara Hudson's small apartment, painting pale stripes across the faded carpet and worn-out furniture. At 78, Clara woke before the alarm clock, as she always did, her body conditioned by decades of early shifts and endless routines. The room around her bore the marks of a life lived simply: an old wooden dresser with chipped handles, a kettle that whistled only if coaxed, and a single-framed photograph of her younger self with a piano in the background, its edges curling with age. Clara stared at that photograph for a brief moment, as she often did, before rising with a quiet sigh. She moved carefully, her joints stiff but steady, pulling on her neatly pressed uniform, a pale gray dress and apron that had seen years of careful laundering. Everything about her was meticulous. Her shoes shone, though they were plain. Her hair, streaked with silver, was neatly pinned back. In the mirror, her dark skin, softened with age, bore the faint creases of time, lines etched deeply at the corners of her eyes from years of smiling at others while holding back her own feelings. The bus ride to the hotel was as routine as her mornings. Clara sat near the window, hands folded over her modest purse, watching the city glide by. Towering glass buildings reflected the early sun. Stores displayed glittering merchandise behind spotless windows, and expensive restaurants set tables for patrons who would never know her name. She felt no bitterness toward them. It was not envy that lived inside her, but a quiet acceptance, like rain soaking into the ground. She belonged to a world that stayed in the background, where people worked unseen so that others could enjoy comfort without noticing the hands that made it possible. The hotel where she worked loomed ahead, a grand 20-story building with marble columns and gold trim that gleamed even in cloudy weather. Guests came and went with luggage that cost more than her annual pay. Clara entered through the staff entrance in the alleyway, exchanging polite nods with other employees rushing past. Most were younger than her by decades, their conversations fast and lively, peppered with jokes she didn't quite catch. Clara remained silent, slipping through the narrow corridors toward the locker room. Inside, she changed into her work shoes, sturdy and practical. A few younger maids were gathered nearby, chatting and laughing in a cluster. One of them, a girl in her 20s with bright red lipstick and loud earrings, glanced over and smirked. "Mornin', Miss Hudson," she said, dragging out the words with mock cheer. "Ready to polish another 100 floors today?" Her friends chuckled softly, not cruelly perhaps, but carelessly. Clara smiled faintly and nodded, her usual response. They rarely meant true harm, but the casual dismissiveness reminded her how they saw her, an old woman who had spent her life scrubbing, tidying, and fading into the background. The day unfolded as always. She moved from room to room, changing linens, wiping down polished wood, vacuuming carpets so plush her feet sank into them. Guests rarely looked at her. If they spoke, it was brief. A request for extra towels, a thank you muttered without eye contact. She had mastered invisibility long ago. To the guests she was simply housekeeping, a figure who arrived when needed and vanished when her work was done. But in the quiet hours, when hallways emptied and rooms fell silent, Clara found her own small solace. Sometimes, after setting up a ballroom for a luncheon or banquet, she lingered a few minutes longer than necessary, drawn to the grand piano that always occupied the center of the stage. It gleamed beneath the soft glow of chandeliers, its polished black surface flawless, its keys untouched except during special events. One late afternoon, as she dusted the instrument, she dared to press a single key. The note rang out, pure and steady, filling the empty room like a secret whispered aloud. Clara's fingers hovered there, trembling slightly, and then she pressed another, then another, until a faint melody formed. It was hesitant, broken, but recognizable, a fragment of an old hymn she had once played by heart. Her mind drifted backward, carried by those notes to another lifetime. She saw herself at 7, sitting on a rickety wooden stool in her parents' cramped living room, staring at the scratched keys of a second-hand piano her father had somehow managed to buy from a neighbor. It had been their only extravagance. Her father worked long shifts at a steel plant, his hands calloused and scarred, while her mother sewed clothing for neighbors to earn a little extra money. They were poor, but when that battered piano arrived, it felt like magic. Clara remembered the first time she touched it, her small fingers awkwardly pressing keys as she giggled at the sounds. Her parents couldn't afford lessons, so she learned by listening. She would sit for hours beside the radio, ears straining to catch every note, then hurry to her piano and mimic the melodies she heard. Day after day, she practiced until her fingertips ached, her legs dangling from the stool. By 15, Clara could play anything she heard, her talent blooming despite the absence of formal training. Neighbors would gather outside the open window to listen, clapping after each song. The pastor at their church asked her to play during Sunday services, and soon she was invited to perform at weddings and community events. Clara's gift became her refuge, her dream, her identity. Music felt like breathing, effortless and necessary. She imagined herself one day on a stage, wearing a flowing gown, playing to an audience that marveled at her skill. She even caught the attention of Mr. Jacobs, the only music teacher in their small town, who offered her free lessons after hearing her play. Under his guidance, Clara learned to read sheet music and tackled the works of Bach, Chopin, and Mozart, her fingers dancing with precision and grace. But dreams have a fragile nature, easily broken by the weight of reality. At 17, her mother fell ill, pneumonia stealing her breath. Hospital bills mounted, and her father's factory laid him off. Clara abandoned her lessons to work at a local diner, pouring coffee and scrubbing tables late into the night, her hands too tired to play when she returned home. Her brothers needed food. Her father needed help. The piano gathered dust in the corner. By the time her mother passed away, Clara's dreams had already faded into something distant, like a melody heard through walls. She didn't resent her choice, it had been necessary, but each time she walked past that silent piano, something inside her ached. Soon, she left home entirely, moving to the city in search of steady work. Music, once her lifeline, became a memory folded neatly away. A sudden sound pulled her back to the present, the creak of a door. Clara quickly pulled her hands away from the keys, heart fluttering, and glanced over her shoulder. No one was there. The ballroom remained empty, the polished tables and chairs set perfectly for an event scheduled later that evening. Still, her pulse raced. She wiped her hands on her apron, as though ridding herself of evidence, and resumed her duties. That night, when she returned home, she sat at her small kitchen table and traced invisible piano keys across its surface, humming softly to herself. She could still remember the feel of the keys, the way the notes flowed together beneath her fingertips. It had been so many years, yet the music lived in her bones. Clara didn't know why the memory had returned so strongly now. Perhaps it was age, or the sight of that beautiful grand piano day after day, reminding her of what she had lost. Perhaps it was simply longing, quiet, persistent longing that had never truly gone away. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and the dim glow of the streetlight outside, she whispered to herself, "I still remember." And she did. Though no one else in the world knew it, though she herself had not touched a piano in decades, the music was still there, waiting like a seed buried deep in winter soil, patient and silent, yearning for spring. The next morning, Clara rose again before dawn, put on her uniform, and walked back into the Grand Hotel, where she was nothing more than another shadow in the hall. Yet, somewhere inside her, faint but steady, that seed stirred. The days that followed were much the same as they always had been for Clara, filled with the muted rhythm of labor that began before the sun rose and ended long after it had set. Yet something lingered inside her from that afternoon in the empty ballroom when her fingers had dared to press those keys. It was as though she had awoken a part of herself that had been sleeping for decades, and now it stirred restlessly, whispering to her in moments of stillness. When she polished mirrors or folded linens, she found her mind drifting to the feel of ivory beneath her fingertips, the way chords blossomed into fullness, the way melody once felt alive inside her chest. One quiet evening, she found herself alone in the ballroom again. The event scheduled there had ended hours earlier, and guests had retired to their rooms, leaving the vast room still and hollow. She moved methodically through her work, wiping down tables and stacking chairs with practiced efficiency. The piano stood on the stage, gleaming under the soft light of the chandeliers. It drew her like a beacon, commanding her gaze even as she tried to ignore it. Finally, when her duties were done, she glanced toward the doors. The room was empty. No footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. No voices carried through the walls. Slowly, almost against her will, she climbed the few steps up to the stage and stood before the piano. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. She sat down, heart pounding in her chest, and placed her fingers gently on the keys. For a moment, she hesitated, as if afraid that the sound would betray her age, that her hands would fail her. Then she pressed a note, soft and low. It rang out pure and clear, filling the empty room. Another note followed, then another, tentative but true, and soon a simple melody began to take shape, one of the first hymns she had ever learned as a girl. The sound wrapped around her like warmth. She closed her eyes, letting the muscle memory take over, her fingers stumbling here and there but quickly finding their way, rediscovering pathways she thought long lost. The notes rose and fell like a tide, delicate and haunting, and for a fleeting moment she felt weightless, transported back to that tiny living room with its peeling wallpaper and her father nodding along proudly as she played. But the illusion shattered in an instant. "Mrs. Hudson!" The voice was sharp, cutting through the music like a blade. Clara froze, her fingers halting mid-phrase. Her eyes flew open. At the far end of the ballroom, framed in the doorway, stood Mrs. Harding. The hotel's senior manager strode forward, her heels striking the polished floor with the precision of a metronome. She was immaculate as always, hair pulled tight into a bun, a fitted blazer in perfect order, her expression sharp enough to slice. Clara rose quickly from the bench, her heart pounding, stepping back as though she had been caught committing a crime. She began, but Mrs. Harding raised a hand, silencing her. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Her voice rang out through the empty hall, clipped and icy. "I was just—" Clara faltered, clutching the hem of her apron. "I finished the cleaning early, and I only meant to—" "To what?" Mrs. Harding cut in, eyebrows arched. "Pretend you're a guest. Play around with an instrument that costs more than your entire year's salary." Clara felt the words like a slap. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Behind them, the doors creaked again, and a handful of younger staff appeared, drawn by the noise. 2 housekeepers lingered by the entrance, whispering, while a bellboy leaned casually against the frame, smirking. Clara could feel their eyes on her, hear the stifled laughter in their throats. "I'm sorry," Clara said softly, lowering her gaze. Mrs. Harding folded her arms. "I don't want apologies, Mrs. Hudson. I want discipline. This is a professional establishment. The guests trust us to maintain standards. Staff do not touch what is not theirs. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am," Clara murmured. "Good. From now on," Mrs. Harding said, sweeping her eyes toward the watching employees, "I want it understood by all of you. No one, and I mean no one, touches this piano unless they are authorized. It is not a toy for the staff to amuse themselves with." The bellboy chuckled under his breath, and one of the maids, a young woman named Tasha, grinned and whispered, "Guess Mozart here will have to retire her act." Another laugh followed, sharp and cruel in its casualness. Clara stood rooted in place, her face burning, her hands tightening around her apron. "Get back to your duties," Mrs. Harding snapped, and the small crowd dispersed, still whispering as they left. Clara remained alone with her humiliation, staring at the piano that moments ago had felt like an escape. Now it loomed before her like a wall she would never climb again. That night, she returned home later than usual. The city streets were quiet, slick with recent rain, and the neon signs of corner shops reflected dimly in the puddles. In her apartment, she set her bag down on the chair and sat at the small table in her kitchen, resting her hands flat on its worn surface. Slowly, almost unconsciously, her fingers moved over the tabletop in the shapes of chords she had once known. She closed her eyes, hearing the phantom notes in her mind, but they sounded hollow now, like echoes trapped in a well. Her chest felt tight. She had endured years of invisibility, decades of being overlooked and underestimated, and she had accepted it as her lot in life. But this, being mocked openly, reduced not only to her job but to nothing more than an object of amusement, cut deeper than she expected. Perhaps because it wasn't just about work. It was about what she had been, what she still carried inside her, and the cruel certainty that no one around her would ever see it. The next day, whispers followed her like shadows. In the break room, she overheard 2 younger maids giggling over the incident. "Did you see her face when Mrs. Harding caught her?" one said, barely stifling laughter. "She looked like a kid stealing cookies." The other chimed in. "I heard she used to play piano, like professionally or something. Can you imagine? Now she scrubs floors instead. That's life for you." They laughed again, not out of malice but ignorance, unaware of how their words pierced. Clara said nothing. She busied herself with her mop and her cart, retreating into silence as she had always done. But at night, when she lay awake staring at the ceiling, she couldn't help but replay the scene in her mind. She saw herself at the piano, heard the notes she had played, felt the sting of Mrs. Harding's voice and the laughter that followed. It twisted inside her, a mixture of shame and longing so fierce it left her breathless. On the 3rd night after the incident, she sat in her kitchen again, her hands poised above the table as though it were a keyboard. Slowly, she began to hum, faint at first, a melody she remembered from long ago. Her voice trembled with age, but carried the tune, fragile and real. The music lived still, buried deep beneath layers of dust and years of silence, but alive nonetheless. In that moment, she made herself a quiet promise. She would not let it die entirely. Even if the world never heard her play again, even if no one ever cared, she would hold on to it, if only for herself. Yet fate, as it often does, had other plans. The following week, the hotel announced something that made every employee perk up and whisper among themselves: a grand charity gala, a lavish evening intended to raise funds for the rebuilding of a local children's music school destroyed in a recent fire. Clara listened in silence as Mrs. Harding explained the details at the morning staff briefing, her voice brisk as always. There would be dignitaries attending, business leaders, donors, and journalists. Everything had to be flawless. A famous pianist had been hired to perform, she added, and there was to be a concert in the ballroom as the centerpiece of the evening. The words struck Clara like a spark in dry tinder. A concert, here in the very room she cleaned daily. A piano played not by dusty memory but by living hands. She felt something stir within her, faint but insistent, like the echo of a long-forgotten song calling her name. As the briefing ended and staff dispersed to their tasks, Clara lingered, her gaze drawn to the ballroom doors. She imagined it filled with guests in glittering attire, music cascading from the grand piano. For the first time in many years, her heart quickened not from fatigue but from anticipation. What she did not yet know was that this gala would become the turning point of her life, the moment when everything she had buried, every dream, and every humiliation would come crashing into the light. The days after the humiliating incident passed slowly, but the announcement of the gala gave Clara something to cling to, even if she did not fully understand why. It was not as though she had been invited, nor would she be allowed to attend as anything more than part of the cleaning staff, invisible at the edges of the glittering event. Yet, the thought of music, real music, returning to that ballroom filled her with a quiet, persistent excitement that she tried to suppress but could not ignore. The preparations for the gala began almost immediately. The hotel buzzed with activity as if an unseen current had electrified its marble halls. Every morning, Clara was met with lists of extra tasks, each one more demanding than the last. The floors were to be polished to a mirror shine, every brass fixture buffed until it gleamed, every window wiped until the city outside looked like a painting in glass. Florists came and went, carrying towering arrangements of roses and lilies that filled the air with their heavy, sweet fragrance. Delivery men wheeled in crates of crystal glassware and fine china that Clara handled with trembling caution, terrified of breaking even a single piece. She noticed how even the staff seemed to move differently now, their usual chatter subdued in the face of the upcoming spectacle. Some of the younger maids whispered about the guests who were expected to attend. "Did you hear? The mayor's going to be there," one of them said breathlessly. "And those tech investors from New York, the ones who tip like it's nothing." The bellboys joked about dressing better than the guests themselves, though they knew their uniforms would never change. Clara listened in silence, quietly folding linens, her mind elsewhere. She could see it already in her imagination. The piano, at center stage, bathed in light, its lid open wide, sound pouring out to fill the vaulted ceiling and echo off the gilded walls. It had been so long since she had heard such music in person. Even the idea of it stirred something old and restless inside her, like a wound she thought had healed only to realize it still ached when touched. The piano itself became a kind of anchor during those long days of preparation. Each time she passed it while cleaning the ballroom, she could not help but glance at it, her steps slowing just enough to study its polished surface. It was tuned for the event, its keys cleaned and gleaming in orderly rows of ivory and ebony. The sight of it made her fingers twitch involuntarily, her hands itching for the sensation of contact. She longed to sit down and simply play a single note, to let the sound ring out in the emptiness as it had that day before Mrs. Harding had caught her. But now, more than ever, she knew better than to try. Mrs. Harding seemed to hover constantly, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Clara could feel her presence like a shadow behind her. She still remembered the sting of that public reprimand, the cruel laughter that followed, and it was enough to keep her in line. She told herself it didn't matter, that she could be content just to hear someone else play, but that lie was thin and wore thinner with every passing day. At home, her thoughts kept returning to the same place. She found herself digging through old drawers one evening, searching for something she had not seen in years. Beneath a stack of yellowed bills and faded photographs, she uncovered a small, frayed notebook. Its cover was cracked and worn, and when she opened it, the faint scent of aged paper rose into the air. Inside, in her own careful handwriting, were pages of music, pieces she had copied out by hand decades earlier, when she could not afford proper sheet music. Bach, Chopin, Schubert. Her fingers trembled as she traced the notes on the page, the symbols etched as clearly into her memory as they were in ink. She carried the notebook to her table and sat down, the silence of her apartment wrapping around her like a heavy cloak. Slowly, she placed her hands on the table and began to move her fingers as though over keys, soundless yet precise, shaping each chord in her mind. At first it felt awkward, clumsy, but soon the motions became smoother. She could almost hear it, the faint echo of the music that once flowed effortlessly through her hands. Night after night she repeated the ritual. Sometimes she hummed softly to herself, her voice thin and wavering, filling the room with half-remembered melodies. It felt foolish, perhaps even childish, but it soothed something deep inside her, some part of her that had been starved too long. She knew she would never have the courage to touch that piano in the ballroom again, not after what had happened, but she could keep the music alive here, in the privacy of her own home, where no one could stop her. The day of the gala approached like the tide, inevitable and steady. The hotel became a hive of frantic activity, and Clara, like all the others, worked herself to exhaustion. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached, polished silver until her fingers cramped, and stayed late into the night dusting the grand chandeliers that sparkled above the ballroom. Even so, when she caught sight of the piano as she cleaned, her heart still gave a small, treacherous leap. The younger staff noticed her glances. One afternoon, while wiping down tables near the stage, Clara heard Tasha's voice from behind her. "Careful, Miss Hudson," the girl said with a teasing lilt. "Stare at that piano too long, and Mrs. Harding will have you scrubbing toilets for the rest of your life." A ripple of laughter followed from the others nearby. Clara didn't respond. She simply bent her head and kept working, though her cheeks flushed hot. That night, however, she dreamed of the piano. In her dream, she was not wearing her uniform, but a simple white dress like the one she'd worn at her first church recital, her fingers flying across the keys with ease. The room was full of light, and the music soared, filling her chest with such fierce joy that it woke her. For a long moment, she lay in the dark, heart pounding, the echo of that imagined music ringing in her ears. The morning of the gala dawned cold and bright, the winter air crisp enough to sting her lungs as she stepped out onto the street. From the moment she arrived at the hotel, she could feel the change. Staff moved briskly, voices sharp and clipped. Guests in glittering attire began to arrive hours before the event, their laughter and perfume spilling through the halls like a promise of the evening to come. Clara worked in a daze, sweeping through corridors, adjusting chairs, and carrying trays of glasses until her back screamed. Yet none of it dulled her awareness of what was coming. She stole a glance into the ballroom as the sun dipped low outside. It was nearly unrecognizable, transformed into a vision of opulence. Golden light from chandeliers reflected off crystal vases. Tables draped in white silk held arrangements of roses so large they seemed to spill outward in waves of red and cream. And at the center, on the stage beneath its own pool of light, the piano gleamed as if it were alive. She paused for a moment longer than she should have, the sight pulling her forward like a tether. For an instant, she imagined herself sitting there, the hall silent, her hands poised over the keys. Then someone brushed past her, breaking the spell. "Hudson!" Mrs. Harding's voice barked, making her flinch. "Stop standing around and help with the seating charts." Clara nodded quickly and moved on, but that brief vision lingered in her mind. She could not shake it, not even as she worked through the evening, slipping unnoticed between tables to tidy what needed tidying. When the guests finally began to file in, resplendent in their finery, she stood at the edge of the room, pressed into the shadows, her gaze fixed on the stage. She waited, heart beating faster than it had in years, for the moment the pianist would take his seat. But even in that charged moment, she could not have imagined how events would unfold, nor how close fate was to pulling her from those shadows entirely. The music she longed for was coming, but with it, so was something else, a chance she had never expected, one that would force her to confront everything she had buried deep inside and demand, at last, that she reclaim it. The evening of the gala began with a feverish energy that seemed to ripple through every corner of the hotel. Guests in shimmering gowns and tailored suits filled the lobby, their laughter mingling with the distant sound of clinking glasses. Photographers snapped pictures near the entrance where a crimson carpet had been rolled out, capturing images of donors and socialites who reveled in the attention. For Clara, who stood discreetly near the edges of it all, there was something almost otherworldly about the spectacle. She was used to working among wealth, but this was something different. A convergence of elegance and performance, a stage set for the city's most privileged. Clara moved through the bustling hallways quietly, ensuring that everything was as it should be. She straightened tablecloths, polished smudges from silver trays, and carried stacks of extra napkins to the servers who darted about with urgency. The air smelled of expensive perfume, wine, and lilies from the extravagant floral arrangements that lined the ballroom. She felt invisible, as always, gliding in and out of sight, but her heart still fluttered every time her gaze drifted towards the stage and the piano gleaming under its spotlight. She lingered there longer than she should have, watching the bustle of final preparations. The pianist, she told herself, would be arriving soon. She imagined him stepping onto that stage, sitting down with the kind of confidence only a true artist carried, filling the room with music that would leave even these polished, distracted guests breathless. She could almost hear it already, the swelling notes, the crisp rhythms, the hush that would fall over the audience. But at exactly 7 o'clock, as the first wave of guests settled into their seats, a ripple of unease began to spread among the staff. Clara noticed Mrs. Harding near the doors, speaking urgently into her phone. The manager's usually sharp posture was tauter than usual, her mouth pressed into a thin line. A few waiters exchanged confused glances, whispering as they passed trays back and forth. Clara brushed past them on her way to collect empty glasses, catching fragments of hushed conversations. "What's going on?" one server asked another in a low voice. "He's not here," came the reply. "The pianist. His flight's grounded. Snowstorm in New York. They just called." Clara froze mid-step, her hands tightening around the tray she carried. The words hit her like a sudden gust of cold air. "What do you mean, grounded?" "They're saying he's stuck at the airport. There's no way he'll make it tonight." For a moment, the sounds of laughter and polite conversation from the guests felt distant, muted beneath the pulse of panic spreading through the staff. Clara glanced towards Mrs. Harding, who now stood with two of the event organizers, their faces pale and anxious. They spoke in harsh whispers, gesturing toward the stage, toward the piano that sat ready and waiting for hands that would not come. Within minutes, the tension spilled beyond the staff. A few of the more attentive guests began to sense that something was amiss. Their murmurs rose like a growing tide. One sharply dressed man near the front checked his watch repeatedly, muttering to his companion. Clara stepped closer, instinctively drawn to the scene unfolding near the stage. She could hear Mrs. Harding's voice now, sharp and desperate. "We cannot cancel," she hissed to the organizers. "We have over 200 guests out there. The donors are expecting a performance. We'll look like fools if we send them home after one speech and some wine." "What do you want us to do?" one of them replied, exasperated. "There is no pianist. We can't conjure one out of thin air." "We'll have to play recorded music," another suggested weakly. "And insult every person who paid thousands to be here? Absolutely not," Mrs. Harding snapped. Their words clashed in the air, an ugly contrast to the elegance surrounding them. Clara stood motionless nearby, her heart hammering. The thought of the piano, of it sitting silent before this glittering audience, struck her with a deep ache. It was unbearable to imagine such an instrument left untouched on a night like this. One of the bellboys, passing behind her, muttered with a smirk just loud enough for others to hear, "Hey, maybe Miss Hudson should give it a try. She loves that thing." Several staff members snickered quietly. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her gaze fixed on the stage. The whisper carried farther than intended. Tasha, the young maid who had teased her before, overheard it and grinned mischievously. "You know," she said, loud enough for a small cluster of workers to hear, "I bet she could play better than some recording." "Go on, Miss Hudson, give us a show." A few laughed, their voices sharp with mock amusement. Clara stiffened. She wanted to disappear, to retreat into the anonymity she wore like armor. But instead, something else stirred inside her, an old, stubborn flicker she hadn't felt in years. She glanced at the piano again, at its gleaming surface, its keys calling to her like an echo from another life. The argument near the stage grew louder, and the guests were beginning to notice. The low hum of conversation spread across the room, restless and expectant. Mrs. Harding looked as though she might burst, her composure unraveling thread by thread. Clara stepped forward before she had even fully decided to. Her voice, quiet but steady, cut through the air. "I can play." It was not loud, but it was enough. Every head near her turned. Mrs. Harding's expression twisted, confusion flashing into disbelief. "What did you say?" Clara swallowed, her hands trembling slightly but her voice firmer this time. "I can play. I know the piano." For a moment, silence blanketed the nearby staff, broken only by a faint, incredulous laugh from somewhere in the group. "You?" Tasha said, her eyebrows raised in amusement. "What are you going to do? Play chopsticks for the mayor?" A ripple of laughter followed, but Clara didn't waver. She kept her gaze on Mrs. Harding, her shoulders squared despite the sting of their derision. "I can do it," she said again, "if you'll let me." Mrs. Harding blinked at her, stunned, then pressed her fingers to her temples. "This is absurd," she muttered. "We are not turning this event into some kind of farce." But the restless murmuring of the guests was growing louder. Someone from the event committee leaned in urgently. "We need something, anything. If she can play even halfway decently, it's better than nothing." Mrs. Harding stared at Clara, clearly torn between outrage and desperation. "You're a housekeeper," she said sharply. "You think you can sit up there in front of these people and perform?" Clara hesitated only briefly. "I don't think," she replied softly. "I know." The room seemed to tilt, suspended in a strange stillness. Then, with a sharp exhale, Mrs. Harding waved her hand in defeat. "Fine," she said through clenched teeth. "If this goes badly, Hudson, it's on you." A hush fell over the staff nearby. Some looked skeptical, others bemused, a few curious. Clara ignored them all. Her heart thundered in her chest as she walked toward the stage, her steps deliberate, her mind filled with a single thought. This was her chance. After years of silence, years of dust covering the music inside her, she was finally about to touch the keys again. Not in secret, not in the quiet shadows of an empty room, but in front of an audience that would truly hear her. The guests turned their heads as she ascended the steps, confusion rippling through the room. A murmur rose, puzzled voices asking one another what was happening. Clara felt the weight of every eye upon her, felt the sting of judgment before she had even begun. Dressed in her simple gray uniform, her hair pinned neatly back, she looked nothing like a performer. But she did not stop. She reached the piano and rested her hands lightly on its polished edge. For a moment, she simply stood there, breathing slowly, steadying herself. Then she drew out the bench and sat down. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the piano's lacquered surface, an old woman with tired hands and resolute eyes. She placed her fingers above the keys. The noise of the room dimmed. The murmurs faded. All she could hear now was the pounding of her own heart and the memory of every note she had ever played, waiting in her mind like old friends. Then, with a deep breath, Clara pressed the first key. The first note rang out like a drop of water falling into a silent well, clear and resonant, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Clara's fingers lingered on the key, feeling its familiar smoothness beneath her skin, as though it had been waiting for her touch all these years. Then another note followed, and another, tentative but deliberate, and before long a melody began to take shape, weaving its way through the murmurs of the crowd and stilling them one by one. At first, there was skepticism in the air, palpable and heavy. Guests shifted in their seats, exchanging puzzled glances. A woman in a sequined gown arched her brow, whispering something to her companion behind a manicured hand. A man near the front leaned back with a smirk, clearly expecting little from a housekeeper in her plain uniform. Even some of the staff, standing discreetly at the edges of the room, watched with doubtful expressions, their earlier laughter still lingering in their eyes. But Clara did not see them. She did not hear them. All she felt were the keys beneath her fingers, smooth and cool, and the flood of memory that rose up to meet her like a tide. The stiffness that had haunted her hands and the quiet solitude of her kitchen disappeared, replaced by a sureness she had thought long gone. Her body remembered. Her fingers moved with precision born not of practice, but of something deeper, something woven into her very being. The melody grew richer, expanding outward, and the room's unease began to shift. The whispers faded, the restless movements stilled. Heads turned towards the stage, drawn by the unexpected force in those notes. Clara's posture straightened, her shoulders settling into the familiar rhythm of performance, the world around her shrinking until there was only the piano, only the music, and the silent, rapt faces watching her. She moved into Chopin first, a nocturne she had learned at 17, back when her fingers were nimble and her heart was bright with dreams. It poured from her now like water from a spring long buried, the tender phrases rising and falling with aching beauty. Her hands danced lightly across the keys, coaxing out sounds so delicate they seemed almost fragile, and then swelling into chords full of depth and longing. The room, so noisy minutes ago, was silent now, the kind of silence reserved for church pews and graveyards. Even those who had dismissed her at first found themselves leaning forward, caught off guard by the force of it. In the corner of her eye, Clara saw the edges of movement. Mrs. Harding stood near the doors, her arms folded tight, her mouth parted slightly in shock. One of the servers, who had laughed earlier, now stared openly, a glass tray forgotten in his hands. Near the front, a young girl no older than 10 sat perched on her chair, wide-eyed, clutching at her father's sleeve. Clara smiled faintly as her fingers flew, because this was what she remembered most, that music could speak in ways words never could, reaching places language could not touch. The piece shifted seamlessly into Bach, her fingers crossing and weaving an intricate counterpoint. This was not simply skill, it was muscle memory, honed in the dim corners of childhood rooms where she had played until her knuckles ached. The music was brisk, sharp-edged, precise, but beneath its rigor lay something vibrant and alive. It pulsed through the hall with a kind of restrained power, commanding attention. Heads nodded in unconscious rhythm, eyes fixed unblinking on her hands as they danced, unhurried and unstoppable, across the keyboard. By the time she reached the final cadence, the applause erupted instinctively, raw and loud, breaking the spell only to replace it with another. Clara looked up, startled by the sound. Guests were on their feet now, clapping with hands that stung from force. Their earlier skepticism melted into wonder. Yet she only gave a small nod, her expression calm, and without waiting for the applause to die, she began again. This time, she played not for them, but for herself. A piece she had carried privately for years, one she used to hum in quiet kitchens and dream about in her narrow bed. It was Schubert's Ave Maria, but not the simple arrangement often heard at church services. No, this was the full, intricate version she had once mastered in her youth, and it unfolded like a confession, each note steeped in emotion. Her hands trembled slightly at first, not from fear, but from the weight of it. Every chord seemed to hold the years she had lost, the quiet grief of choices made, the unspoken longing she had carried like a stone in her chest. But then something remarkable happened. As she played, it no longer felt heavy. The sorrow in those notes transformed, lifting, reshaping itself into something luminous and whole. And then it happened, softly at first like a ripple through still water. Someone in the audience began to hum along. Then another voice joined, and another. Soon, the room was filled not only with her music, but with dozens of voices blending gently, instinctively, as if compelled by something larger than themselves. No one had been asked to sing. No conductor had guided them. It simply happened, as though the music demanded it. Clara's vision blurred with tears. Her fingers never faltered. She felt the sound surrounding her, lifting her higher, carrying her far beyond the walls of that ballroom and into some place she had not touched in decades, a place of pure joy, pure being. She was not a housekeeper now. She was not invisible. She was simply Clara, the girl who had once dreamed at an old piano in a tiny house, the woman who had held that dream through silence and ridicule, and who at last was letting it speak. When the final note faded, it hung in the air for a breathless instant before the applause thundered through the hall. People rose to their feet in unison, clapping so hard it echoed like rain on a tin roof. Many were crying openly, wiping at their cheeks with silk gloves and handkerchiefs. Even Mrs. Harding's rigid expression had softened, her hands joining reluctantly in the ovation. Clara stood slowly, her legs trembling, and bowed her head slightly. She was overwhelmed, almost disbelieving. Yet, as she looked out over the sea of faces, she saw nothing but admiration staring back at her. For the first time in years, she felt seen, truly seen, and it was both terrifying and beautiful. When she stepped away from the piano, she was met by a rush of people. Guests surged forward to speak to her, their voices tumbling over one another in excitement. "Extraordinary," one man said, shaking her hand fervently. "You were extraordinary." A woman pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes shining. "I haven't heard anything that moved me like that in decades." Another guest leaned close, whispering as though sharing a secret. "Where have you been hiding all this time?" Even the staff approached her with hesitant awe. Tasha, who had laughed at her so easily before, now stared at her with something like shame and wonder. "Miss Hudson," she said quietly, I didn't know." Clara only smiled gently, too tired and too full to hold grudges. As she stood amid the sea of faces and voices, Clara felt something settle inside her, a calm unlike any she had known in years. Tonight, she had not only saved a gala from disaster, she had reclaimed herself. The music that had been buried beneath decades of work and silence was alive again, and it had reached people, truly reached them. Little did she know, though, that this was only the beginning. For as she descended the stage and the applause still rang in her ears, a few guests discreetly raised their phones, uploading videos of her performance to social media. By morning, the world beyond that ballroom would know her name. Clara barely slept that night. When she returned to her apartment, she sat for a long time in the quiet kitchen, her hands folded loosely on the table as if they still remembered the weight of the keys. Her small, worn room seemed somehow different, infused with an unfamiliar brightness, though nothing had changed. She had replayed the evening in her mind over and over. The hush that had fallen over the ballroom, the surge of voices singing softly with her, the roaring applause that seemed to shake the very walls. It all felt unreal, like a dream she was terrified to wake from. When dawn broke, pale light spilling over the narrow street outside her window, Clara rose from her chair and made herself a cup of tea, hands trembling slightly as she poured. She expected the glow of the evening to fade with the coming of day, for everything to return to its familiar rhythm, quiet anonymity, long hours, and the steady hum of work. But when she arrived at the hotel that morning, still dressed in her uniform, she was met with something entirely unexpected. People stared, not with the usual indifferent glances given to someone like her, but openly, curiously. A few guests even smiled at her as they passed, one of them stopping to say, "I saw you last night. You were magnificent." Clara blinked, unsure how to respond. Another nodded politely, murmuring, "That was a gift, what you did." The words left her flustered, warmth rising in her chest that she didn't quite know how to hold. It wasn't only the guests. Even among the staff, there was a change. The whispers that once followed her like shadows were gone, replaced by something quieter, tinged with awe. Tasha approached her in the hallway, her posture unusually hesitant. "Miss Hudson," she said softly, not meeting Clara's eyes at first. I wanted to apologize for before. I didn't know you could do something like that." Clara simply smiled, her voice gentle. "It's all right, dear. None of you did." But the true magnitude of what had happened revealed itself later that afternoon, when Sister Elaine, one of the older housekeepers, found her during a break in the staff lounge and showed her something on her phone. "You need to see this," Elaine said, holding out the screen. Clara leaned closer, her brow furrowing as she watched a shaky video of herself seated at the piano the night before, her fingers flying over the keys. She recognized the sound instantly. Chopin's Nocturne, the very piece she had played first, though recorded on a device held by someone in the audience. The audio was tinny, the angle far from perfect, but it captured everything. The silence in the room, the music swelling, the faces wrapped with wonder. Beneath the video, dozens of comments scrolled rapidly, filled with words like astonishing, beautiful, and unbelievable. "Where did you get this?" Clara asked, bewildered. "It's everywhere," Elaine said, her voice tinged with excitement. "Someone uploaded it last night. It's been shared thousands of times. Look." She scrolled through her screen to show other videos, each from different angles. Her performance of Bach, the moment during Ave Maria when the audience joined in song. The captions varied. "Housekeeper stuns gala with incredible piano performance. 78-year-old woman shocks crowd with hidden talent." But the reaction was the same. People were mesmerized. By evening, Clara's name was on local news sites, her story condensed into headlines that seemed almost absurd. Elderly hotel workers' secret talent goes viral. From housekeeper to maestro, the performance no one saw coming. Reporters began calling the hotel, asking for interviews. A news van parked outside. Even national outlets began picking up the story, fascinated by the unexpected narrative of a woman overlooked for decades who had, in a single night, stunned an entire room and, soon after, an entire audience beyond its walls. The hotel's management, caught off guard, pivoted quickly. Mrs. Harding, who only days earlier had scolded her so harshly, now summoned Clara to her office with a strained smile. "We are proud to have you as part of our staff," she said carefully, her tone rehearsed. "What you did last night reflected beautifully on this hotel." Clara nodded politely, though she detected the discomfort beneath those words, the acknowledgement of how drastically their perceptions of her had shifted. Within days, offers began to arrive. A local news station invited her to perform live on air. A community concert organizer called, asking if she would headline a charity event for the same children's music school the gala had been intended to support. Letters poured in from strangers across the country, handwritten notes delivered to the hotel, emails forwarded by staff. Some were simple expressions of admiration. "You reminded me that beauty still exists in this world." Others were deeply personal. "I quit music when I was young. Watching you play made me pick it up again." One afternoon, while sitting in the break room during lunch, Clara listened as a young bellboy, barely 20, read aloud a message that had been shared online by a girl who had seen one of the videos. "I want to be like her when I'm older. She makes me believe it's never too late." Clara's eyes misted, her fingers curling tightly around her teacup. She had not expected any of this. She had only wanted to help, to fill the silence when no one else could. But perhaps what moved her most was an invitation that came 2 weeks later from the rebuilt children's music school. They asked if she might visit, not to perform, but simply to sit with the students, to talk about music, to show them what was possible even when the world told you no. Clara accepted immediately. The day she arrived, the school's modest new building was filled with eager faces. Children clustered around her, some barely tall enough to reach the keys of the piano they had just acquired with the funds raised from the gala and its aftermath. Clara sat among them, guiding their hands gently, her voice patient and kind. "One note," she told them, "is where it all begins. Just one note, and the rest will follow." As she demonstrated simple scales, she felt a deep glowing contentment settle over her. These children, with their bright eyes and small, clumsy fingers, reminded her of herself long ago, perched on a rickety stool in her parents' living room, dreaming of a future that seemed impossibly far away. She realized then that her music had not only returned, it had found purpose. It was no longer hers alone. It was something to be shared, something to pass on. Weeks turned into months, and though she remained at the hotel, her life was no longer defined by quiet labor. She continued to perform occasionally at charity events, always insisting on donating any payment back to causes that needed it more than she did. Each time she sat at a piano now, she felt the same rush she had experienced that night in the ballroom, but steadier, calmer, no longer shadowed by fear or shame. In the evenings, after her shifts, she returned to her apartment, where the old notebook of music remained open on her table. She still traced the notes with her fingers, still played invisible keys in the quiet, but now it was different. Now she knew there would be other pianos, other rooms filled with listening hearts. One spring afternoon, she stood in the modest practice room of the children's school, surrounded by a half-dozen eager students. She guided them patiently, showing them how to place their hands, correcting their posture, laughing softly when a boy banged out a discordant chord with too much enthusiasm. Through the open window, warm sunlight streamed in, glinting off the polished wood of the piano. Clara's hands rested on the keys, her eyes bright as she watched the children mimic her motions. In that moment, she understood something profound. She had not reclaimed her music simply for herself. It had been waiting all along to be given away, to spark something in others as it once had in her. She no longer thought of the years lost or the dreams deferred. She thought only of what lay ahead, the simple joy of sitting beside these children, of passing on the gift that had carried her quietly through so many silent years. As their laughter mingled with the clumsy notes of their practice, Clara smiled, her heart light. For the first time in decades, her world felt full, vibrant, alive with possibility. The invisible woman had vanished. In her place stood Clara Hudson, not merely a housekeeper or a pianist, but a teacher, a guide, and a testament to the truth she had proven without meaning to. It was never too late to bloom, never too late to let the music inside you be heard. And as she pressed the keys once more, surrounded by children who looked at her as if she were magic itself, Clara felt certain that her song would go on long after her hands were still, carried forward in theirs. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, share this video with others, and check out our next and other videos.